They say a house is built with bricks and mortar, but a home is built on trust and truth. When those foundations begin to rot, the entire structure, no matter how magnificent, is destined to crumble into dust. For Elara Davenport, that crumbling didn't happen slowly. It wasn't a quiet decay hidden behind walls. It was an explosion, a public demolition in the grand ballroom of her own home, orchestrated by the one person who was supposed to be her family. The occasion was her 5th wedding anniversary, a glittering affair designed to showcase the Davenport dynasty's perfection. Crystal glasses chimed, a string quartet played softly in the corner, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and quiet power. Elara, dressed in a gown the color of midnight, moved through the crowd with a practiced grace, a smile fixed on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. The moment came when her mother-in-law, Beatrice Davenport, the unyielding matriarch of the family, stood to give a toast. Beatrice commanded attention without ever raising her voice. She was a woman carved from ice and ambition, and tonight she looked particularly regal. She raised her glass, not to her son and daughter-in-law, but with her eyes locked directly on Elara. "We are here to celebrate commitment," Beatrice began, her voice smooth and cold. "But we must also acknowledge when that commitment is broken, when a vow is made into a mockery." A confused murmur rippled through the guests. Elara's heart began to beat a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. Beside her, her husband Liam shifted his weight, a subtle movement of discomfort. Beatrice continued, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "I have a special anniversary gift for my daughter-in-law." She gestured to a polished mahogany table where a single thick manila folder lay, a small token of the truth. With a dramatic pause, she slid the folder across the table. It stopped just inches from Elara's hand. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside were photographs. Grainy, distorted images of her, laughing with a male colleague at a business lunch, a hand on his arm. Another of them walking down a street, the angle making it look far more intimate than it was. Behind the photos was a typed report from a private investigator, detailing fabricated meetings and trysts. "You have brought shame upon this family." Beatrice's voice cut through the stunned silence. "You have dishonored my son and sullied the Davenport name with your filth." Every eye in the room was on Elara, 100 silent judgments piercing her skin. She felt the blood drain from her face, her breath catching in her throat. She looked for an ally, for a lifeline. She looked to her husband. Liam stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the bubbles rising in his champagne flute, refusing to meet her eyes. He said nothing. Not a word in her defense, and in that deafening silence, Elara felt the true betrayal. It wasn't the lie in the folder or the hatred in her mother-in-law's eyes. It was the absolute, soul-crushing abandonment from the man who had vowed to stand by her forever. She was utterly, completely alone. Before the explosion, there was the slow, meticulous construction of the cage. To the outside world, the marriage of Elara and Liam Davenport was a modern fairy tale. He was the handsome heir to a storied East Coast fortune, she the brilliant and beautiful architect who had captured his heart. Their life was a carefully curated gallery of perfect moments. Sun-drenched holidays in the Mediterranean, front-row seats at charity galas, and serene weekends at the sprawling family estate in Connecticut. But a gallery is a place for observation, not for living, and every moment of Elara's life within the Davenport sphere was under the cold, scrutinizing gaze of its curator, Beatrice. Elara hadn't come from nothing, but in the eyes of the Davenports, she might as well have. Her father was a respected professor, her mother a librarian. They were a family built on books, ideas, and modest comfort. Elara had inherited their intellect and a quiet ambition, graduating top of her class in architecture, with a portfolio that promised a bright, self-made future. Then she met Liam. Their meeting was a whirlwind of genuine romance, far from the calculated matchmaking of his world. He was charmed by her passion, her independence, the way she spoke about building spaces for people, not just monuments to wealth. For a time, their love felt like a world of its own, a sanctuary from the rigid expectations of his lineage. But when you marry a Davenport, you don't just gain a husband, you are absorbed into an empire, and its empress was Beatrice. From the very beginning, Alara was a project for her mother-in-law, a rough stone that needed to be cut and polished into the Davenport image, or discarded. The sacrifices began subtly. Alara took a less demanding position at a prestigious firm, framing it as a desire for better work-life balance, but knowing it was to be available for the endless roster of social obligations that came with her new name. She traded her minimalist, modern aesthetic for the heavy brocade and dark wood of the Davenport homes. She learned about equestrian bloodlines, vintage Bordeaux, and the intricate politics of the local yacht club, all subjects that felt foreign on her tongue. She did it for Liam, believing that her efforts would eventually bridge the chasm between her world and his. Liam, for his part, was a man caught between two powerful forces, the wife he genuinely loved and the mother he was conditioned to obey. He was a master of placation, a charming diplomat in the no-man's land of his own family. In the early days, he would defend Alara in small ways, a gentle hand on her back when Beatrice's comments grew too sharp, a whispered, "Don't listen to her," when they were alone. But years of living under his mother's suffocating influence had eroded his spine. He was not a cruel man, but his weakness was a form of cruelty in itself. He would stand by, silent and uncomfortable, as Beatrice delivered her passive-aggressive critiques. "That's a fascinating perspective, Alara," she would say, after Alara offered an opinion on art or politics, so different from how we tend to see things. When Alara redecorated their guest house in a style Beatrice deemed too contemporary, the furniture was quietly replaced a week later with pieces from storage. Liam's only explanation was a helpless shrug. "It's just easier this way, darling. You know how she is." Each time he chose the path of least resistance, he left Alara to face the cold front alone, chipping away at the foundation of their partnership. Beatrice's disapproval was a constant, low-frequency hum beneath the surface of their lives. But her primary weapon was comparison, and her standard-bearer of perfection was a woman named Sophia Langley. Sophia was everything Alara was not, the daughter of a rival blue-blooded dynasty, a woman who had been raised for a life of effortless wealth and social maneuvering. Beatrice spoke of Sophia constantly, weaving her name into every conversation like a golden thread of disappointment. "Sophia just joined the board of the museum," she would announce at dinner, her eyes flicking to Alara. "Such a demanding role, but she manages it. Some women are just born with that kind of fortitude." The implication was always clear. Alara was not. Sophia became a phantom limb in their marriage, an ever-present reminder of Alara's perceived inadequacy. Alara knew with a dreadful certainty that Beatrice had always intended for Liam to marry Sophia, to merge their two family empires into an unassailable fortress of old money and influence. Alara wasn't just an unsuitable wife, she was a strategic failure. And so, they performed. They smiled for the photographers from high society magazines, their bodies angled towards each other in a perfect imitation of intimacy. They hosted dinner parties where the conversation was as polished and empty as the silverware. They built a life that looked flawless from a distance, a life of enviable privilege and ease. But behind the closed doors of the Davenport mansion, the air was thin and cold. Dinners for three were often conducted in near silence, with Beatrice issuing quiet directives to the staff, Liam scrolling through his phone, and Alara pushing food around her plate, feeling more like a ghost than the lady of the house. The grand halls of their home echoed with unspoken tensions. Alara found her refuge in her work, in the clean lines and logical structures of her architectural drawings. It was a world where things made sense, where a strong foundation guaranteed a stable structure. It was everything her life with the Davenports was not. She held on to the hope that her love for Liam, and his for her, was the one true beam supporting their lives. She believed that if she was patient enough, loving enough, and strong enough, she could withstand the pressure from Beatrice. She didn't realize that the foundations were already rotten, and the woman she called her mother-in-law was not just waiting for the house to fall, she was holding a lit match, ready to set it all ablaze. The 5th anniversary party was Beatrice's masterpiece, a symphony of power and prestige conducted with her signature, invisible baton. The guest list was not a collection of friends, but an assembly of assets. Judge Albright, whose rulings often favored Davenport Industries; the Hendersons, who held a crucial voting bloc on the board, and a dozen other families who formed the intricate web of their social and financial world. Beatrice had curated this audience with the same precision she used to select her diamonds. She needed witnesses. She needed a jury for the trial she was about to convene. Ilara, oblivious, played her part as the gracious hostess, refilling the judge's glass, laughing at a joke from Mrs. Henderson, all the while feeling the familiar, low-level anxiety that permeated any event hosted by her mother-in-law. She caught Liam's eye across the room, and he gave her a quick, reassuring smile, a fleeting moment of warmth that she clung to like a talisman. The first discordant note sounded when Beatrice tapped a silver spoon against her crystal glass. The gentle hum of conversation immediately ceased. All eyes turned to the matriarch. She stood near the grand fireplace, her posture impeccable, a figure of serene authority. "My dear friends," she began, her voice resonating with a practiced, somber warmth. "Thank you all for joining us to celebrate 5 years of what we had all hoped would be a blessed union for my son, Liam." She paused, letting the strange phrasing settle into the room. Family, to a Davenport, is not merely a bond of affection. It is a legacy, an institution, and the foundation of any institution is integrity, honor, loyalty. Ilara felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. This was not the celebratory toast she had expected. Beatrice's eyes, cold and dark, found hers. "It is therefore with the heaviest of hearts," Beatrice continued, her voice taking on a tone of theatrical grief, "that I must address a shadow that has fallen upon our house, a betrayal that strikes at the very core of our family." She gestured towards the mahogany table, where the innocuous-looking folder lay. This was the moment described in the introduction, but now it unfolded with excruciating slowness. The walk to the table felt a mile long. The silence in the room was a physical weight, pressing down on Ilara, making it hard to breathe. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the clasp. The photograph spilled onto the polished wood. There she was, with David Chen, a senior architect from her old firm. The first photo was at a coffee shop, their heads bent over a blueprint. The caption below, in stark, clinical type, read, "Subject meeting with associate at a discreet location." Another photo showed her laughing as David held an umbrella over both of them in a sudden downpour. The caption, "Subject displaying intimate behavior in public." It was a masterwork of malicious framing. Every innocent moment, every professional interaction had been twisted, curated, and presented as a sordid affair. The accompanying report was a litany of half-truths and outright lies, chronicling her supposed infidelity with the detached authority of a legal document. She looked up from the toxic pages, her mind reeling, searching for an anchor in the sea of hostile faces. She saw only suspicion and a lurid curiosity. The whispers started then, a sibilant hiss that spread through the room like wildfire. "I always thought there was something off about her," a voice hissed from her left. "So ambitious," another murmured from the right. "Poor Beatrice. Poor Liam." She was being convicted without a trial, based on evidence forged in the fires of her mother-in-law's hatred. "Lies," Ilara whispered, the word barely audible. She turned, her entire being focused on one person, Liam, her husband, her partner, the man who knew she'd been working with David on a pro bono project for a new community center, the man who knew her, who loved her. She pleaded with her eyes, begging him to speak, to shatter this nightmare, to tell them all the truth. He stood rooted to the spot, his face pale, his knuckles white as he gripped his champagne glass. He looked from the photos on the table to his mother's triumphant face, and then, finally, his eyes met Ilara's. For a fraction of a second, she saw a flicker of panic, of guilt. But it was extinguished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a mask of pained resignation. He cleared his throat. The entire room held its breath, waiting for the husband's verdict. "Mom," Liam said, his voice strained, barely above a whisper, "let's not make a scene. Maybe we should talk about this in private." The words struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. It was not a defense. It was not a request for reason. It was a plea for social decorum. He wasn't horrified by the injustice. He was embarrassed by the spectacle. In that moment, the man she loved vanished, replaced by a stranger, a coward, his mother's son. The last thread of hope snapped. Beatrice, sensing her victory, moved in for the final, killing stroke. Her voice was no longer sorrowful, but sharp and absolute. "There is nothing to talk about. The evidence speaks for itself." She turned to the head of her private security detail, who had been standing discreetly by the door. "Victor, please escort this woman out of my house." The word woman, not daughter-in-law, not even Alara, hung in the air, stripping her of all identity and connection. Victor, a large man who had always been polite to her, approached with a look of genuine pity in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said softly. Alara didn't move. She was paralyzed, her mind unable to process the speed of her own destruction. She looked at Liam one last time, a silent, final appeal. He wouldn't look at her. He turned away, presenting her with his back, a final, definitive act of abandonment. That was what broke the spell. A cold, clear rage began to burn through the shock. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and looked directly at Beatrice. She said nothing. Her silence was her only remaining shield. She turned and walked away, Victor trailing a few feet behind her. She moved with a strange, dreamlike calm through the crowd of statues, their faces a blur of judgment and morbid fascination. The enormous oak doors of the Davenport mansion, which had always felt so imposing, swung open. She stepped out into the cold, damp night. The doors closed behind her with a heavy, final thud, the sound of a vault being sealed. The faint, mocking sound of the string quartet, starting up again, drifted through the wood, and Alara stood alone on the manicured stone steps, stripped of her husband, her home, and her name, with nothing left but the chilling truth of her betrayal. The sound of the closing door was a physical thing, a solid wall of oak and iron that severed Alara from her life. One moment she was Mrs. Alara Davenport, mistress of a grand estate. The next she was a trespasser on its manicured lawn. The cold night air, scented with damp earth and boxwood hedges, was a shock to her lungs. For a long, silent moment, she simply stood there, a statue in a midnight blue gown, the gravel of the long, winding driveway pressing into the thin soles of her shoes. The muffled sounds of the party, of the life that was no longer hers, seemed to come from another world. Her first instinct was purely practical, a desperate grasp for normalcy. She reached into her clutch for her phone to call a car, but her hands were shaking so violently she could barely unlock the screen. When she did, she found herself staring at a photo of her and Liam, smiling on a beach in Capri, a ghost from a life that had just been murdered. A wave of nausea washed over her. She began to walk, a slow, aimless drift down the mile-long driveway, away from the warm, mocking lights of the house. Each step was a tiny act of will. The manicured perfection of the estate now seemed menacing, the ancient, weeping willows like silent, judgmental observers. When she finally reached the ornate iron gates at the end of the property, she felt like an exile passing through the borders of her own country. The real world hit her with the rush of passing headlights on the dark country road. It was after midnight. She was miles from the city, dressed in a gala gown, with no car and no plan. She kept walking until she saw the distant, fluorescent hum of a 24-hour gas station, a lonely beacon in the darkness. Inside, the clerk gave her a strange look, but she ignored him, heading straight for the payphone, a relic from another era. She didn't have any change. She went to the counter to buy a bottle of water, pulling out the credit card Liam had always called their emergency card. The clerk swiped it. A harsh beep cut through the quiet store. He swiped it again. "Sorry, ma'am. It's declined." Alara stared at him, confused. "That's not possible. Try it again." He did, with the same result. She handed him her debit card, the one linked to their primary joint account. "Declined," he said, his voice flat with indifference. A cold dread, colder than the night air, began to seep into her bones. It wasn't a mistake, it was a command. They hadn't just thrown her out, they had cut her off. She was financially erased. The speed and efficiency of it were breathtakingly cruel. She had no cash, just a useless collection of plastic cards and a designer clutch bag. Panic, sharp and suffocating, began to set in. There was only one person she could call, one number she knew by heart that existed entirely outside the Davenport universe. She used the store's phone to call her best friend, Chloe. The phone rang 3 times before Chloe's sleepy, concerned voice answered. "Alara, what's wrong?" "It's 1 a.m. Alara opened her mouth to speak, but all that came out was a dry, ragged sob. The dam of her composure broke, and the full, crushing weight of the night's events came crashing down. She wept into the grimy receiver, unable to form words, only sounds of pure anguish. Chloe didn't press for details. Her voice sharpened with immediate, fierce loyalty. "Where are you? Tell me exactly where you are. I'm coming to get you." An hour later, Alara was huddled in the passenger seat of Chloe's beat-up hatchback, wrapped in a worn university sweatshirt that smelled of her friend. They drove in silence towards the city, towards Chloe's tiny, book-filled apartment that was both a haven and a painful reminder of the simple, independent life Alara had left behind. The moment the apartment door closed behind them, Alara's remaining strength deserted her. She collapsed onto the sofa, the sobs she had choked back for hours racking her body. It was a storm of grief and rage. Grief for the man she thought she had married, the love she thought was real. Rage at Beatrice's calculated cruelty, at Liam's spineless betrayal, at the friends who had stood by and watched her humiliation in silence. Chloe didn't offer empty reassurances. She simply made tea, sat on the floor beside the sofa, and remained a steady, quiet presence in the wreckage, a lighthouse in Alara's personal hurricane. She must have drifted into an exhausted, dreamless sleep because the next thing she knew, sunlight was streaming through the window and her phone was vibrating on the coffee table. The screen displayed a name she hadn't seen in years. Arthur Sterling, the senior partner at the Davenport family's law firm. He was a portly man, with what she had once mistaken for a kindly smile, who had walked her through her prenuptial agreement, assuring her it was all just a formality. Her hand trembled as she answered. "Alara," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. It was the voice of a man executing a transaction. "I am calling to inform you that our firm will be representing Mr. Liam Davenport in divorce proceedings. Papers will be filed this morning." Alara was speechless. Less than 12 hours had passed. "The filing," Sterling continued in his cold, precise monotone, "will cite irreconcilable differences, but I'm sure you understand that we will be invoking Clause 17B of your prenuptial agreement regarding infidelity." Clause 17B. She remembered it now. A section she had barely glanced at, believing it was irrelevant. It stated that in the event of proven adultery by either party, the unfaithful spouse would forfeit all claims to any marital assets, property, or alimony. It was a kill switch. "But that's not true," she stammered. "The evidence is fabricated." Sterling let out a short, dry sigh, the sound of a man swatting away a fly. "The evidence is, in our professional opinion, compelling. We have sworn testimony from a licensed investigator and clear photographic documentation. I would advise you, for the sake of your own dignity, not to contest this. The Davenport family is prepared to be discreet if you are willing to be cooperative. Sign the papers, and this can all be over quietly. Fight it, and I assure you, the contents of that folder will become public record." It was a threat, delivered with the dispassionate air of a weather report. She was being offered a choice: accept her complete annihilation in silence, or be further humiliated in a public forum. She had no resources to fight. As she hung up the phone, the last vestiges of shock and grief burned away, leaving behind a terrifying, icy clarity. This wasn't a sudden, emotional implosion. This was a demolition, planned and executed with military precision. The private investigator, the doctored photos, the audience of influential guests, the immediate financial cutoff, the pre-dawn call from the lawyer with the divorce papers already drawn up. It was all connected. It was a conspiracy. And Liam. Liam wasn't a bystander caught in the crossfire. He was a co-conspirator. He had stood beside her at that party, knowing the axe was about to fall, knowing the lawyers were waiting for their cue. He had watched her be destroyed, and had given his silent consent. The depth of his betrayal was monstrous, almost incomprehensible. Alara stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling city below, a world that was moving on as if hers hadn't just ended. The tears were gone. In their place, a cold, hard resolve was beginning to form in the pit of her stomach. They had pushed her out of their perfect world, expecting her to crumble and disappear. They had underestimated her. They had mistaken her kindness for weakness. And in doing so, they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The first few days were a gray, featureless fog. Alara existed in the small space of Chloe's guest room, which had become her entire world. Time moved strangely, stretching and compressing, marked only by the shifting light through the window. She would sit for hours, staring at nothing, the vicious loop of the party playing over and over in her mind. Beatrice's cold smile, the shocked faces of the guests, Liam's averted gaze. It was a film reel of her own execution. Chloe was a quiet, constant presence, leaving food by the door that Alara barely touched, and cups of tea that grew cold. She knew that there were no words that could patch a wound so deep, so she offered the simple, profound gift of her unwavering belief, a silent testament that Alara was not crazy, not worthless, not the person they had painted her to be. But Alara felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of a life she was no longer a part of, her own future, a terrifying, blank void. On the third day, the past arrived in a cardboard box. A courier, with a face full of professional indifference, delivered a large, plainly wrapped package. Her name was written on the side in a hurried, unfamiliar script. Alara Davenport. The use of her married name felt like a final, cruel twist of the knife. It was a box of her things. The personal effects the Davenport staff had deemed were unequivocally hers. It was an act of administrative banishment, a cold, final clearing out of her existence from their home. For a full day, she let the box sit in the corner, a silent, menacing monolith. It was a tombstone for her marriage, and she was terrified to open it. But on the fourth day, a new feeling began to stir beneath the thick blanket of grief, anger, a slow, hot burn of indignation. How dare they? How dare they reduce her 5 years, her love, her sacrifices, into a box of disposable memories? With a resolve that surprised even herself, she knelt on the floor and tore open the tape. It was an archaeological dig through the ruins of her life. Out came the books she'd stacked by her bedside, a worn copy of her favorite novel next to a newer volume on architectural theory. There were framed photos of her own family, thankfully untouched. There were the cashmere sweaters she loved, folded neatly, and the running shoes she wore on weekend mornings. Each item was a small, sharp memory. Then, she saw it, tucked between a silk blouse and a stack of her architectural journals, one of Liam's jackets. It was a dark gray, cashmere-lined jacket she had bought him for his 30th birthday. They must have packed it by mistake. A fresh wave of pain washed over her. She remembered how his face had lit up when he'd opened the gift, how he'd said the lining felt like a secret hug from her. She picked it up, intending to toss it aside, to discard this painful remnant of a man who no longer existed. But as she held it, the scent of his cologne, faint but unmistakable, clung to the fabric. It was a gut punch. She ran her hand over the soft wool, a sort of masochistic farewell, and her fingers brushed against something stiff in the inner breast pocket. Curiosity, the first active emotion she had felt in days, nudged through her despair. She reached inside. It wasn't a wallet or a phone. It was a single, sleek, black plastic sleeve, the kind used to hold a hotel key card. It was heavy, expensive feeling. Embossed on the front in minimalist silver lettering was a name she had never seen before, The Alibi. Beneath the name was a simple, stylized logo of a keyhole. There was no address, no city, just that name, The Alibi. The irony was so stark, so on the nose, it felt like a message from a particularly cynical god. Her heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. Why would Liam have this? It wasn't from a hotel chain he used for business. Those were always Marriott's or Hyatt's, predictable and corporate. This felt different, secretive, discreet. Her fingers, now steady and deliberate, slid into the sleeve. There was no keycard inside. Instead, there was a small, square cocktail napkin made of thick, high-quality linen paper. On it, written in Liam's familiar, slightly slanted handwriting, was a date from 3 months ago and a simple notation: anniversary, S anniversary. Her mind raced, sifting through dates. It wasn't their wedding anniversary. It wasn't the anniversary of when they met. It was just a date, a random Tuesday in late spring. Then she saw the initial, S. A cold, dreadful suspicion began to crystallize in her mind. S for Sterling, number S for Sophia. She pulled out her phone, her movements no longer sluggish but sharp, with a sudden, urgent purpose. She opened her old calendar, her thumb scrolling frantically back through the months. She found the date, and her breath caught in her chest. That Tuesday was the second day of a 3-day business trip Liam had taken to Chicago for what he had called a last-minute real estate summit. She remembered the trip perfectly now. She had been disappointed he had to go, as they had plans that week. He had been oddly vague about the details, brushing off her questions with talk of boring syndication meetings. When he returned, he seemed off. A little too cheerful, a little too eager to please, bringing her a generic I Love Chicago mug from the airport gift shop. At the time, she had chalked it up to exhaustion. Now, seeing this date, this initial, on a napkin from a hotel called the Alibi, his behavior took on a sinister new meaning. The architect in her, the part of her brain that had been dormant and buried under layers of pain, suddenly switched on. Her mind had been a chaotic ruin of emotions, but now it had found a piece of evidence, a single, hard data point that did not fit the established narrative. An architect cannot build on a flawed blueprint, and she could not rest on a foundation of lies. The story they had created that she was the adulterer was the official blueprint. But this cocktail napkin was a structural anomaly. It was a crack in their foundation. And with that realization, the question that had been torturing her for days finally changed. It was no longer, "Why did this happen to me?" It was now, "What is this lie meant to cover up?" The grief was still there, a vast, cold ocean inside her. But now, a small island of purpose had emerged from the water. They thought they had silenced her, that she would crawl away in shame and disappear. They had written her ending for her. But holding this small piece of evidence in her hand, Alara Davenport realized they had not written the end. They had only provided her with a beginning. Proving her innocence was no longer the goal. That was a defensive game, and she was done being on the defensive. She was going to uncover the truth, not for a jury or a judge, but for herself. She was going to find out what really happened at the Alibi. And she was going to use their secrets to build a new structure, a scaffold for her own brand of justice, right on the ruins of their lies. The fog of grief did not lift, but Alara learned to navigate through it. The despair was no longer a paralyzing weight, but a cold, clear lens through which she now saw the world. At Chloe's small kitchen table, which had become her war room, she laid out the cocktail napkin and the black key card sleeve. They were no longer just painful reminders, they were architectural drawings for an investigation, the starting point of a new, complex blueprint. But blueprints and plans required resources, and she had none. The Davenports had stripped her of everything, or so they thought. They had forgotten about the woman she was before she had their name, a woman who had her own achievements, her own small treasures. Tucked away in a velvet box was her proudest accomplishment from her single life. A brooch she had designed herself, a complex, star-like burst of sapphires and diamonds. Commissioned with the prize money from the prestigious Lowell Architectural Award, she had won a year before she met Liam. It was a symbol of her talent, her independence, her own self-made worth. Selling it felt like cutting off a part of herself, but it was a necessary amputation. She went not to a pawn shop, but to a discreet, appointment-only jeweler in the city's diamond district, a man her father had once known. He recognized the quality of the craftsmanship and the stones instantly, and after a quiet, respectful negotiation, he gave her a fair price. She left the shop with a thick envelope of cash in her purse, the weight of it both a burden and a liberation. She had traded a piece of her past for a chance at a future, converting a symbol of her old identity into the fuel for her new mission. The next step was finding a professional. This was not a battle she could fight alone. Chloe, through a friend of a friend, who was a public defender, found a name: Marcus Thorne. He was a private investigator, but the term felt too crude for his reputation. He was known as a truth retrieval specialist. His services were notoriously expensive, his methods unorthodox, and his discretion absolute. He was exactly what she needed. Their meeting took place in the hushed academic silence of a university library's rare books room, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten stories. Marcus was not what she had expected. There was no trench coat or cynical world weariness. He was a man in his late 40s, dressed in a simple gray suit that fit perfectly, with intelligent, observant eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. He had the calm, focused demeanor of a chess master. Alara didn't cry or rage. She laid out her story with the calm precision of an architect briefing a contractor. She detailed the structure of the Davenport family, the key players, the public accusation, and the coordinated legal and financial assault. Then, she slid the keycard sleeve and the napkin across the polished table. "This is all I have," she said, her voice steady. "My husband, Liam, was supposedly in Chicago for a real estate conference on this date. I need to know what the alibi is, where it is, and what he was doing there. And I need to know who Essie is, though I have a strong suspicion." Marcus listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the two small pieces of evidence. He picked up the sleeve, feeling the texture of the plastic. He looked at the napkin, studying Liam's handwriting. He was silent for a full minute. "The Davenports," he finally said, his voice a low baritone. "This isn't a messy divorce, Mrs. Davenport. This is a corporate-style takedown. They're not just divorcing you. They're trying to erase you." He named his price, a figure that made her stomach clench, even with the envelope of cash in her bag. He saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. "My fee is high because the risks are high," he explained calmly. "And because I get results." Alara didn't hesitate. She pushed the envelope across the table. "This is the down payment. It's everything I have. Find the truth, Mr. Thorne. I'm not just looking for proof of an affair to help my divorce case. That's their game, not mine. I'm looking for leverage. I need to understand the real reason they went to such extreme lengths to destroy me." Marcus looked from the cash to her determined face. A flicker of something respect, perhaps, crossed his features. He slid the envelope back towards her, taking out only a third of the cash. "This is enough to start," he said. "Let's see what the truth is worth." He took the sleeve and a high-resolution photo of the napkin, leaving the original with her. "Don't contact me. I'll contact you. And stay off your personal phone and computer. From now on, you're a ghost." While Marcus moved through the shadows, Alara began her own quiet, parallel investigation. She became a creature of public libraries and anonymous coffee shops with free Wi-Fi, using encrypted browsers on public access computers. She was no longer just the client. She was an active researcher, a partner in her own vindication. She started by building a timeline, a meticulous reconstruction of the last 2 years of her marriage. She cross-referenced Liam's business trips with his credit card statements she had saved on an old personal hard drive. She scoured the social media accounts of Sophia Langley and her circle, searching for clues, for photos, for any overlap with Liam's travel. It was painstaking, mind-numbing work. But with every data point she entered into her spreadsheet, with every connection she mapped out, she felt a piece of herself returning. The architect, the strategist, the problem solver, the woman she had been before she became a Davenport, was re-emerging from the ruins. A week later, the call came. It was from a number she didn't recognize. "It's Thorne," the voice said, without preamble. "The alibi is a hotel. Tribeca, New York City, not Chicago." That was the first lie. "It's an unlisted, invitation-only establishment for the mega-rich who want absolute, guaranteed privacy. No website, no reviews. Getting their guest list is next to impossible. But I have a source on the inside, a sommelier who owes me a favor." He confirmed Liam Davenport was a guest on the date in question. He was there with a woman. My source didn't see her clearly, but he remembered the reservation. It wasn't in Liam's name. It was booked and paid for by a corporate account belonging to Langley Holdings. Langley Holdings. Sophia's family company. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The ground didn't drop out from beneath her. This time, it solidified. The suspicion she had been nursing was now a fact. Cold and hard and undeniable. Her husband hadn't just had an affair. He had conducted it with the very woman her mother-in-law had chosen for him, and they had used her family's corporate resources to hide it. Ilara thanked Marcus and hung up. She stood up from the library computer, the fear and grief that had been her constant companions now overshadowed by a powerful, clarifying rage. This was never just about an affair. This was about a replacement. And she, Ilara, had been the obstacle that needed to be ruthlessly removed. The game was far bigger and dirtier than she had imagined, and she was just beginning to learn the rules. The confirmation from Marcus that Liam had lied about his location was the first tremor, a sign that the ground beneath her enemy's story was unstable. But Ilara knew she needed more than a tremor. She needed an earthquake. She spent the next few days in a state of suspended animation, a taut, vibrating wire of anxiety and anticipation. She went through the motions of life, eating the food Chloe prepared, walking through the city streets like a phantom, but her entire consciousness was focused on one thing, waiting for Marcus's next call. It came on a gray, overcast morning. His voice was the same as always, devoid of emotion, a simple instrument for conveying facts. "Meet me, the north side of the reservoir, by the running track." 1 hour. Then he hung up. The air by the reservoir was cold, carrying the damp, earthy scent of impending rain. Ilara sat on a secluded bench, pulling her coat tighter around herself, watching the determined, rhythmic figures of runners circling the track. They were moving forward, focused, each step taking them closer to a goal. It was a stark contrast to her own life, which felt like it had been violently thrown off its course. She saw Marcus approaching, a nondescript figure in a dark coat, blending seamlessly into the muted landscape of the city. He sat down beside her, leaving a professional, calculated distance between them. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He simply handed her a slim, unmarked tablet. "The sommelier came through," he said, his voice low. He remembered the couple because the woman sent back a $2,000 bottle of wine, claiming it was corked. He said she was particular. He made sure to get a clear look at them when he brought the replacement. He worked security on the side. For a bonus, he pulled the lobby footage from that night. Her hand trembled as she took the tablet. Her own reflection stared back at her from the dark screen for a second, a pale, haunted face she barely recognized. She pressed play. The video was short, less than 30 seconds, and filmed from a high, discreet angle in what was clearly an opulent, modern hotel lobby. There was no sound, but none was needed. A black town car pulled up outside. A doorman opened the passenger door. Out stepped Sophia Langley, dressed in a sharp, elegant pantsuit, looking every bit the confident heiress. A moment later, Liam emerged from the other side. The camera quality was sharp, unforgiving. There was no mistaking him. He handed his keys to a valet and then turned to Sophia, his face breaking into a relaxed, familiar smile. A smile Ilara hadn't seen directed at her in years. He placed his hand on the small of Sophia's back, a gesture of casual, confident intimacy, and guided her through the revolving doors. They were laughing about something. They looked like a power couple arriving at their own private kingdom. They looked happy, they looked right. And that, more than anything, was what shattered Ilara's heart into a million irreparable pieces. Marcus had also loaded several documents onto the tablet. She swiped to the next file. It was a copy of the hotel folio. The suite had been booked for 2 nights. The name on the reservation was not Liam's, but it was charged to a corporate American Express card issued to Langley Holdings. She saw the room service charges: champagne, oysters, a late dinner for 2. Liam's familiar, slightly slanted signature was at the bottom of one of the receipts. It was all there. A cold, neat, undeniable paper trail leading directly to the heart of his betrayal. She stared at the screen until the images blurred. the pain so sharp and physical it felt like a hand squeezing her lungs, making it impossible to breathe. It was one thing to suspect, to piece together clues. It was another thing to see it, to witness the casual intimacy, the smiling ease with which her husband inhabited his secret life, the life he had clearly wanted over the one he had with her. She handed the tablet back to Marcus. "Thank you," she said, her voice a hollow whisper. He took it, his expression unreadable. "This is the proof of the affair," he stated, "but it's not the motive for the frame-up. An affair is common. An orchestrated campaign to destroy a spouse's reputation is not. The level of planning here is unusual." He stood up. "My work on this phase is done. Let me know if you want me to proceed to the next." He then turned and walked away, disappearing back into the city's gray anonymity, leaving Ilara alone on the bench with the ruins of her marriage laid bare. She sat there for a long time, the cold from the bench seeping into her bones. The runners continued their endless loops. The pain was immense, a tidal wave that threatened to pull her under. But as the waves of pure, raw heartbreak crashed and receded, something else began to surface. It was the architect's mind, the part of her that saw patterns and structures, that understood that every design had a purpose. Marcus was right. This wasn't just a messy, passionate affair. This was a project, and it had been meticulously planned. She began to connect the dots, not with emotion, but with cold, hard logic. Beatrice had always championed Sophia. For 5 years, Sophia's name had been a constant refrain, a yardstick against which Ilara was always measured and found wanting. Liam, weak and eager to please his mother, had likely been seeing Sophia for months, perhaps even longer. Their affair wasn't a transgression, it was an audition. And Sophia had apparently passed. But they had a problem, Ilara. A loyal, faithful wife who could not be easily discarded. A divorce would be messy. Without cause, the prenuptial agreement would grant her a comfortable, if not extravagant, settlement. She would remain in their social circle, a constant, awkward reminder of Liam's failure. So they needed a cause, they needed a weapon, and so they had built one. The accusation of infidelity against her was the masterstroke of their design. It was brilliant in its cruelty. It triggered Clause 17b, cutting her off financially and leaving her powerless. It painted her as the villain, allowing Liam to play the part of the wronged husband, garnering sympathy. It provided the perfect moral cover for him to, after a suitable period of mourning his broken marriage, publicly embrace Sophia, the woman who had healed him. The world would see it as a beautiful second chance, not the ruthless execution of a hostile takeover. The scale of the conspiracy was breathtaking. It wasn't just Liam and Sophia sneaking around. This was a three-headed serpent. Liam's weakness, Sophia's ambition, and Beatrice's venomous, strategic hatred. They had worked together, pooling their resources, the Langley Holdings credit card, the Davenport family lawyers, Beatrice's social power to systematically dismantle Ilara's life. The word betrayal felt inadequate. This was a vivisection. They had strapped her to a table in front of their entire world and taken her apart, piece by piece, all while pretending to be the victims. A new feeling began to settle over her, displacing the heat of her anger and the cold of her grief. It was a chilling, absolute resolve. The video, the receipts that was their story, the secret they had tried to protect. But it wasn't the weapon she would use against them. Proving Liam's affair would only make her look like a vengeful ex-wife in a standard, sordid divorce. No, that wasn't enough. That was playing their game. To truly achieve justice, she had to find a secret of her own, a secret so fundamental, so devastating, that it wouldn't just expose an affair. It would bring the entire, rotten house of Davenport crashing down. The evidence Marcus had provided was a loaded gun, but Ilara knew that firing it in a courtroom would only wound them, leaving her caught in the messy crossfire of a public divorce scandal. That was their battlefield, their game. She needed to choose a different field of battle entirely, one where they wouldn't see her coming. She needed to move beyond the personal and attack the institutional. Her first step was to secure new legal counsel. Chloe's public defender friend, while well-meaning, was out of his depth. Ilara needed a shark, a specialist in the murky, treacherous waters of high-stakes corporate litigation. After days of research at the library, she found a name: Anya Sharma. Sharma was a legendary attorney known for two things: her astronomical fees and her penchant for taking on cases against corporate Goliaths and winning. She was notoriously selective, rarely taking on divorce cases. Alara secured a consultation through a combination of persistence and a carefully worded email that hinted at financial impropriety within a major family-owned corporation. She walked into Anya Sharma's minimalist, steel and glass office, feeling woefully out of place, armed with only a single box of old financial statements and a burning, audacious goal. Anya was a woman in her 50s, sharp, impeccably dressed, with an air of intense, focused intelligence. She listened to the story of the divorce, the accusation, and the affair with a look of professional boredom. It was, for her, a depressingly common tale of rich people behaving badly. "So," Anya said when Alara finished, her tone clinical, "you have proof of his infidelity. We can use that to contest the prenup. We might be able to negotiate a respectable settlement for you to go away quietly." "Is that what you want, Mrs. Davenport?" "No," Alara said, her voice clear and firm. "What I want has very little to do with a settlement. Liam and his mother believe they are untouchable. Their power comes from their name, their legacy, and their money. I want you to attack the source of that power. I want a full forensic audit of Davenport Industries. Going back to its founding, I have reason to believe there may be irregularities." Anya raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. This was unexpected. "You want to fund a corporate forensic audit, a process that could cost 7 figures to gain leverage in a divorce case? What irregularities are we talking about?" Alara looked her straight in the eye. "I don't know yet, but an empire that ruthless is usually hiding something. I'm an architect, Miss Sharma. I know that when a facade is that perfect, it's often designed to hide a structural flaw. I want you to find the flaw." For the first time, a glimmer of genuine interest appeared in Anya's eyes. This was not a scorned wife. This was a strategist. "That," Anya said, a slow smile spreading across her face, "is the most interesting proposal I've heard all year." The weeks that followed were a deep dive into a world of paper and digital dust. Anya's team filed discovery motions that the Davenport lawyers initially dismissed as a nuisance, a fishing expedition. They sent back boxes upon boxes of documents, corporate filings, tax returns, partnership agreements, confident that their secrets were buried too deep to be found. Alara worked alongside Anya's team, her architectural training giving her a unique ability to see patterns and discrepancies in the vast sea of data. She spent her days in a secure conference room, her life reduced to the glow of a laptop screen and the smell of old paper, meticulously cross-referencing decades of financial history. For weeks, they found nothing. The Davenport books were pristine, their legal history seemingly unblemished. The official story was clean. Richard Davenport, Liam's late father, had founded the company in the early 1972 with his brilliant engineering partner, a man named Robert Miller. Miller, the story went, had died of a sudden, tragic heart attack a few years later, and Richard, as the surviving partner, had honorably bought out his shares from the grieving widow to continue their shared dream. It was a young, sharp-eyed paralegal named Ben who found the first thread. He was tasked with the tedious job of digitizing archived county records related to the original partnership. On a grainy, barely legible microfilm reel from 1975, he found a copy of the original share transfer agreement filed with the county clerk's office. Later that day, while comparing it to the clean, official copy provided by the Davenport lawyers, he noticed something, a tiny, almost insignificant detail. The signature of one of the witnesses, a notary public, had a slightly different flourish on the county copy. It was nothing, probably just a variation in the signature, but Ben had been trained by Anya to ignore nothing. He flagged it. That tiny thread was all Anya needed. She pulled. She hired a forensic document examiner, one of the best in the country. He confirmed Ben's suspicion. The notary's signature on the official Davenport copy was a forgery. More damningly, he analyzed the signature of the deceased partner, Robert Miller, on the same document. Using advanced imaging technology, he determined with 99% certainty that it too was a forgery, and a masterful one at that. This signature was signed by a living, confident hand, the examiner's report concluded, not by a man who, according to his death certificate, had been dead for 48 hours. Anya then pulled the coroner's report and old newspaper clippings. Miller's death had been sudden, yes, but it had occurred at his isolated country home, with Richard Davenport being the one to find the body. The coroner on duty, a man who later received a generous, unsecured loan from a Davenport subsidiary, had ruled it a heart attack without a full autopsy. Anya called Ilara into her office. She laid out the documents on the vast conference table: the grainy microfilm copy, the pristine forgery, the examiner's report, the death certificate. They didn't just build a company, Ilara, Anya said, her voice quiet with the gravity of the discovery. They stole one. Richard Davenport forged his dead partner's signature on a document that transferred all of Miller's shares and patent rights to him for a fraction of their value. He presented it to the distraught widow as her husband's last wish. She was in shock, grieving, and she signed everything over. He didn't just cheat a partner. He robbed a widow and her children, using his friend's corpse as a silent accomplice. Ilara stared at the forged signature. In that moment, her own personal tragedy, the affair, the public humiliation, the betrayal snapped into a much larger, darker perspective. This wasn't just about Liam's weakness or Beatrice's cruelty. This was the family business. The entire Davenport legacy, the fortune, the social standing, the very name that Beatrice worshipped with a religious fervor, was built on a crime. Beatrice's obsessive pride wasn't just about protecting her wealth. It was about guarding a foundational lie, a secret so rotten it would vaporize their entire history. The affair with Sophia was no longer the weapon. It was merely a clue that had pointed her toward the real prize. She had been looking for a crack in the wall, but she had just discovered that the entire mansion, the whole glittering empire, was built on a foundation of bone and ink and lies. She now held the detonator. The discovery of the Davenport family's original sin was like finding a load-bearing wall made of rotting timber. Ilara now knew that the entire glittering structure of their legacy was an illusion, poised to collapse at the slightest pressure. The question was no longer if she could bring it down, but how. She now held two weapons, each devastating in its own right. The first was the proof of Liam's affair with Sophia, a story of personal betrayal, meticulously documented. The second was the evidence of the foundational fraud, a story of generational deceit and theft. She had a meeting with Anya Sharma in the lawyer's stark conference room, the files for both secrets laid out on the table like options in a deadly arsenal. Anya, ever the pragmatist, saw a clear path forward. "This is a legal dream, Ilara," she said, tapping the file on the Miller fraud. "We can file a suit on behalf of Miller's estate, with you as the whistleblower. We can tie the Davenports up in litigation for a decade. We can freeze their assets. We can strip them of their company, their homes, everything. We can bleed them dry until there is nothing left. It will be a quiet, brutal, and total victory." Ilara listened, but she shook her head. "A quiet victory isn't a victory at all, Anya. Not for this. A legal battle happens in courtrooms and depositions, behind closed doors. Their real power isn't just their money. It's their name, their reputation. It's the illusion of integrity that Beatrice has spent her entire life curating. Beatrice doesn't fear being poor as much as she fears being exposed. Her punishment has to be as public as my humiliation was." A slow, dangerous smile crept onto Ilara's face. "I don't want to just take their money. I want to take their legacy. I want to stand in the center of their perfect world and show everyone that their idol is made of clay." Anya leaned back in her chair, a look of profound respect in her eyes. "So, you don't want a lawsuit. You want a public execution. Where did you have in mind?" Ilara's answer was immediate. "The Davenport Foundation Annual Charity Gala. It's in 3 weeks." Anya's professional composure momentarily cracked. "The gala? That's their biggest night of the year. The mayor will be there, half the city's elite. You can't just walk in and—" "That's exactly why it has to be there," Alara interrupted, her voice filled with a newfound, chilling authority. It's the pinnacle of their hypocrisy. They stand on that stage and speak about philanthropy and community, all while their entire fortune is built on a crime. It's the one night a year where Beatrice feels completely invincible, surrounded by the people whose admiration she craves most. We're going to turn her coronation into her immolation. The plan began to take shape, not as a legal strategy, but as a piece of architectural design, a meticulously planned demolition. Alara, the architect, was in her element. She envisioned the entire event, every detail, every beat. The centerpiece of her plan was a short film, a presentation she titled, with a touch of dark irony, a tribute to the Davenport legacy. She hired Marcus Thorne for the tactical phase, meeting him in the same anonymous library. This time, she wasn't a desperate victim, she was a client with a clear, high-risk directive. I need to get this video to play on the main screens during the Gala's keynote presentation, she told him, sliding a USB drive across the table. I need to interrupt their broadcast, seize control of their system, and I need it to be untraceable back to us until it's too late. Marcus examined the drive, his face impassive. Their security will be tight. V systems at events like this are usually a closed circuit. That's your problem to solve, Mr. Thorne, Alara said, sliding a second, much thicker envelope across the table. Consider this your creativity budget. I'm not asking if it's possible. I'm telling you to make it happen. The next 3 weeks were a blur of clandestine activity. Alara, with the help of a freelance video editor, Chloe knew a young, anti-corporate artist who loved the idea of the project, began to craft her masterpiece. It was a brutal, elegant piece of psychological warfare. The video started with a montage of glossy images of the Davenport family, sourced from society magazines and news articles. It was set to inspiring, classical music, with audio clips of Beatrice from past interviews, her voice smooth and confident as she spoke of hard work, integrity, and building a legacy for the future. Then, as the music swelled, the image would flicker. The polished photos would be replaced by the grainy, damning security footage from the alibi. The image of Liam, smiling, his hand on Sophia's back, would fill the screen in stark, silent clarity. The music would cut out, replaced by a chilling silence. Then, the screen would cut to the forged document, Robert Miller's signature displayed next to the real one. Text would appear, simple and devastating. The Davenport legacy, founded on a forgery, the 11th of June, 1975. It would show a picture of Robert Miller's young, forgotten family and end on a single haunting question: what is the true price of a good name? While Alara perfected her weapon, Marcus worked his magic in the shadows. He discovered the AV company contracted for the Gala was a mid-sized firm that had a disgruntled senior technician who felt underpaid and overworked. A discreet cash payment and the promise of a plane ticket to a new life in a new country were all it took to secure a backdoor into the Gala's media server. Anya, meanwhile, prepared for the inevitable legal fallout. She drafted cease and desist letters to be sent the moment the video aired, preemptively striking against any media outlets that might try to suppress the story at the Davenports' request. She also quietly reached out to a contact she had, the granddaughter of Robert Miller, a retired history teacher living in quiet obscurity in Oregon, unaware of the crime that had stolen her family's fortune. Anya simply told her that new information regarding her grandfather's estate had come to light, and that she should be prepared for a significant development. Alara was no longer a woman consumed by grief. She was a general on the eve of a great battle, every piece on the board moving at her command. She had transformed her pain into a project, her heartbreak into a blueprint. She felt a strange, cold, calm settle over her. This was bigger than her own suffering now. It was about a truth that had been buried for nearly 50 years. It was for the Miller family, whose name had been erased from history. On the day of the Gala, a final package arrived from a courier, arranged by Marcus. Inside was a ticket to the Davenport Foundation annual charity gala and a small, sophisticated electronic device with a single red button. It was a remote trigger, synced to the media server. At the press of a button, her tribute would play, hijacking every screen in the grand ballroom. She held the invitation in her hand, her name printed on it not as a guest, but as a ghost from their past, returning to haunt the feast. The architect was ready. The demolition was scheduled to begin at 9 o'clock sharp. The day of the gala dawned gray and quiet, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within the city's elite social circles and, more fiercely, within Alara herself. In her small, anonymous apartment, the world felt distant. The sounds of traffic were a muted roar below, a world away from the silent, charged atmosphere inside. On her bed, a dress was laid out like a declaration of war. It was not the midnight blue of her anniversary party, the color of a victim. It was a deep, resonant crimson, the color of blood and life and power. Beside it, on the nightstand, lay the small remote trigger, a simple black rectangle with a single red button, an object holding the power to detonate a dynasty. This was the day of the reckoning. But before she could deliver justice for herself, she had to honor the original victims. Anya had provided her with a phone number for Sarah Miller, the granddaughter of Robert Miller, the man whose legacy had been stolen. Sarah was a retired history teacher, living a quiet life in Oregon, completely unaware that she was the heiress to a phantom fortune. Ilara's hand was steady as she dialed the number. An older woman's cautious, polite voice answered. "Hello? Mrs. Miller," Ilara began, her voice calm and respectful. "My name is Ilara. You don't know me, but I believe I have some information regarding your grandfather, Robert Miller, and his partnership with the late Richard Davenport." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "My grandfather?" Sarah's voice was filled with a weary confusion. "That was a very long time ago. I'm not sure what there is to say. I have spent the last several weeks reviewing the original documents of their partnership dissolution," Ilara continued, speaking with the clear, factual precision of a lawyer. "I have uncovered irrefutable, forensic evidence that the documents used to buy out your grandfather's shares were fraudulent. His signature was forged after his death. His company, his patents, his entire stake in what became Davenport Industries was stolen from your family." The silence that followed was heavier this time, thick with the weight of 50 years of a lie. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was a choked whisper. "Stolen? My grandmother. She died believing my grandfather had left them with nothing but debt. My own father spent his life feeling the shame of that failure. He believed his father had been a poor businessman who lost everything. Your grandfather was not a failure, Mrs. Miller," Ilara said softly, but with unshakable conviction. "He was a brilliant man who was betrayed. I can't change the past, but I can make the truth of it known. Tonight, at a very public event, I am going to expose that truth. I wanted you to hear it from me first." A sound like a muffled sob came through the phone. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Why are you doing this?" Ilara paused, thinking of Liam, of Beatrice, of her own public crucifixion. "Because I know what it's like to have the truth of your life stolen and replaced with a lie," she said. "And because no legacy built on such a rotten foundation deserves to stand." There was another moment of silence, and then Sarah's voice returned, clear and strong. "All my life, I've had only a single, faded photograph of my grandfather. Thank you for giving me back his name. Do what you have to do." The call ended, but the weight of Sarah Miller's words settled upon Ilara, not as a burden, but as a mantle of purpose. This was no longer just her story. She was now an agent of history, a restorer of a stolen truth. The hours leading up to the gala passed in a quiet, focused ritual. Ilara showered, letting the hot water wash away any lingering fear, any trace of the victim she once was. She put on the crimson dress. The silk felt cool and smooth against her skin, a suit of armor for the battle to come. She styled her hair and applied her makeup with the steady hand of a surgeon, creating a mask of impeccable, unassailable confidence. When she was done, she stood before the full-length mirror and faced the woman she had become. The reflection that stared back was a stranger. The soft, accommodating woman who had tried so desperately to win Beatrice Davenport's approval was gone. In her place was a woman with eyes that held the cold, clear light of purpose. A wave of doubt, the last ghost of her former self, washed over her. "Is this who you are now, a small voice whispered. A destroyer? An architect of ruin? She thought of her hands, hands that were meant to design buildings, to create spaces for people to live and thrive. Tonight, they would be used to tear a family down. For a moment, the sheer destructive magnitude of her plan threatened to overwhelm her. She closed her eyes and saw Beatrice's face at the anniversary party, triumphant and cruel. She saw Liam's back as he turned away from her, a final, damning act of cowardice. And she saw the forged signature of a dead man, the ink that had purchased a dynasty. Her eyes snapped open, the doubt vaporized by a clarifying certainty. Destruction, she realized, was sometimes a necessary and creative act. To build a new, honest structure, you first had to demolish the one that was rotten to its core. She wasn't destroying the Davenports. She was simply turning on the lights, forcing them, and the world, to see the rot that had been there all along. The collapse was of their own making. She was merely its architect. Her phone buzzed with a text message from a burner number. It was Marcus. "Is the theater ready for the performance?" she typed. The reply was instantaneous. "The stage is set, awaiting the lead actress." Everything was in place. She slipped the small, powerful trigger into her evening bag. She took one last look around the small apartment that had been her sanctuary and her war room. It had served its purpose. She was leaving it as one person and would return as another. She opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, the crimson of her dress a slash of defiance against the drab, neutral colors. The cool night air hit her face as she stepped onto the street and hailed a cab, giving the driver the address of the city's most prestigious hotel, the site of the Gala. The storm was no longer on the horizon. She was inside it. And she was the one who would direct the lightning. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a universe unto itself, a swirling galaxy of old money and new power, all held in orbit by the gravitational pull of the Davenport name. Chandeliers dripped light like frozen waterfalls onto tables, laden with orchids and silver. The air hummed with the self-satisfied murmur of the city's elite. At the center of it all was Beatrice Davenport, radiant in emeralds and silk, accepting accolades and donations with the regal grace of a queen in her court. She was at the absolute zenith of her glory, the unquestioned empress of her gilded world. And into this perfectly constructed universe, a meteor struck. When Alara walked through the grand archway, a hush fell over the room that started near the entrance and spread like a ripple in a pond. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. 100 pairs of eyes fixed on the woman in the crimson dress, a slash of defiant color in the room's symphony of muted, expensive tones. She looked nothing like the broken, humiliated wife who had been cast out months ago. Her hair was styled in a sleek, severe cut. Her face was calm, her posture radiating an unshakable confidence. She was not a ghost from their past. She was a harbinger of their future. She saw them instantly, standing near the main stage. Beatrice, her smile freezing on her face, a flicker of pure fury in her eyes. Liam, his face draining of all color, looking as though he'd seen an apparition. And Sophia, standing beside him, her hand possessively on his arm, her expression a mixture of shock and contempt. Before Alara could take more than 10 steps into the room, Beatrice was moving towards her, a predator closing in on an unwelcome intruder. Liam trailed in her wake like a nervous shadow. "You have an incredible amount of nerve," Beatrice hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper as she intercepted Alara near a towering floral arrangement, shielded from most of the room's direct view. "To show your face here, after the disgrace you brought upon us, the security guards will be happy to escort you out." Alara didn't flinch. She met her former mother-in-law's gaze with a cool, unnerving calm. "There's no need for that, Beatrice," she replied, her voice even and smooth. "I'm simply here to pay my respects. I've even prepared a small tribute to the Davenport legacy. You, of all people, should appreciate that." The cryptic nature of her response, delivered without a trace of fear, seemed to unsettle Beatrice more than any outburst would have. Alara offered them a small, enigmatic smile, then turned and walked away, leaving them standing in stunned, angry confusion. She found a position near the side of the stage, a place where she could see and be seen, and she waited. She watched as Beatrice, having regained her composure, was introduced as the evening's host. The applause was thunderous. Beatrice took to the podium, basking in the adoration of the crowd, her face a mask of benevolent power. "My dear friends," Beatrice began, her voice resonating through the ballroom. "Tonight, we gather to celebrate not just philanthropy, but the enduring power of legacy." It was the perfect cue. As Beatrice paused for effect, Elara moved. With a smooth, deliberate pace, she walked up the side steps to the stage. A collective gasp went through the audience. Beatrice's head snapped towards her, her face a thunderous mask of disbelief. Before the security guards could react, Elara had reached the second microphone at the podium, standing beside her stunned tormentor. The ballroom was utterly, completely silent. Every phone was now out, recording. Elara leaned towards the microphone, her voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the vast room. "Beatrice is right," she said, her calm tone a shocking contrast to the tension in the air. "Tonight is about legacy, but every legacy is built on a foundation. And before we celebrate the House of Davenport, I believe it's time we all took a closer look at the ground it was built upon." She looked directly at Beatrice, whose face was now pale with a dawning, mortal terror. And inside her crimson clutch, Elara's thumb pressed the single, small red button. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the two enormous screens flanking the stage, which had been displaying the Davenport Foundation logo, flickered to black. The tribute began. The first images were exactly what the audience expected. The glossy montage of the family, the inspiring music, Beatrice's voice speaking of integrity. In the crowd, people nodded approvingly. Beatrice herself seemed to relax for a fraction of a second, a look of confused relief on her face. Then it happened. The music cut out abruptly. The screen flashed, and there, in high-definition clarity, was the silent, damning footage from the alibi. Liam and Sophia smiling, his hand on her back. The shock in the room was a physical force, a wave of audible gasps and frantic whispers. People turned to stare at Liam and Sophia, who stood frozen in the crowd, their faces monuments of horror. Beatrice's hands gripped the podium, her knuckles white, her mouth slightly agape. But that was just the first blow. Before the crowd could fully process the affair, the screen changed again. The forged document appeared, Robert Miller's elegant, forged signature filling the screen. The forensic examiner's stark conclusion appeared in bold, white text. Then, the photograph of the young Miller family, their faces full of a hope that had been stolen from them. The final question, what is the true price of a good name, hung in the chilling silence. The video ended, leaving that question and the two contrasted signatures burning on the screens. The silence in the ballroom was no longer one of shock. It was the heavy, absolute silence of judgment. The story was not just about adultery anymore. It was about a foundational crime, a theft that implicated the sainted patriarch of the Davenport clan. Every banker, every judge, every business partner in that room was now looking at Beatrice not as a queen, but as the head of a criminal enterprise. The silence broke. It was not a wave of conversation, but an explosion. The carefully constructed universe of Beatrice Davenport shattered into a million pieces. People were standing up, talking loudly, their faces a mixture of disgust and morbid excitement. The social event of the year had become a public trial and a conviction, all in the space of 90 seconds. Elara looked at Beatrice one last time. The woman's face was a ruin. The pride, the arrogance, the power, it had all been stripped away, leaving only the hollowed-out shell of a fraud. There was nothing left to say. Her work was done. With a quiet, almost imperceptible grace, Elara placed the microphone back in its stand. She turned her back on the chaos, on the shattered legacy, on the woman she had just destroyed. She walked to the edge of the stage and down the steps. The crowd, a buzzing, chaotic sea of people, parted for her as she walked. No one touched her. No one spoke to her. They just stared, their eyes wide with awe and fear. She walked through the grand ballroom, through the lobby, and out the enormous front doors, leaving the inferno she had ignited to consume everything she had left behind. She stepped out into the cool, clean night air, took a deep breath, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt free. The reckoning was complete. The inferno Elara ignited in the grand ballroom did not burn out by morning. It became a firestorm that consumed the House of Davenport entirely. The aftermath was not a slow decline. It was a spectacular public collapse. The video from the gala went viral before the last guest had even fled the room, becoming a sensation of scandal that news outlets and social media feasted on for weeks. The first casualty was financial. At the opening bell the next day, Davenport Industries stock didn't just drop, it plummeted into an unrecoverable nosedive. The board of directors, in a desperate act of self-preservation, convened an emergency meeting and summarily stripped the Davenport family of all executive and board positions. But it was too late. The company was toxic, a monument to a half-century of deceit. The second casualty was social. The Davenport name, once a synonym for class and power, became a punchline, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. Invitations to every significant event were quietly rescinded. Friends of decades suddenly crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. The impenetrable fortress of their social standing crumbled overnight, leaving them exposed and reviled. The final casualties were personal, and for them, the most devastating. Sophia Langley's family, in a brutal act of damage control, publicly disavowed the engagement and announced a full withdrawal of their investments from any Davenport-affiliated ventures. Sophia, the ambitious princess, was cast out, tarnished by a scandal not of her making but one she had eagerly enabled. Liam, stripped of his family's name, his fortune, and his fiancée, was left with nothing but the crushing weight of his own weakness. He became a ghost in his own city, a man whose only legacy was his cowardice. And Beatrice? Beatrice, the proud empress, suffered the worst fate of all. Her great terror was not poverty, but irrelevance, and that is precisely what she received. She became a recluse in her grand mansion, a house that was soon put up for sale to cover the mounting legal fees from shareholder lawsuits and, most significantly, the massive claim filed by the newly empowered Miller estate. Her friends abandoned her. The society she had ruled over turned its back. Her pride, the central pillar of her entire existence, had been vaporized, leaving behind a bitter, hollow woman, haunted by the silence in her empty palace of lies. Months passed, the seasons changed. The world, as it always does, moved on. Far away from the East Coast's toxic fallout, on a sun-drenched coast where the Pacific Ocean sighed against the shore, Elara was learning to breathe again. She had rented a small, simple bungalow with a view of the water, a space filled with light and air. She had spent her days walking on the beach, sketching the lines of the waves and the cliffs, slowly, carefully, rediscovering the architect she had been and deciding on the woman she wanted to become. She followed the news of the Davenports' demise with a detached, clinical interest, but felt no triumph, no glee. She only felt the profound, quiet peace of a truth finally settled. One afternoon, a man in a perfectly tailored suit arrived at her door. He was a lawyer from a prestigious firm in Portland, Oregon. "Miss Elara," he said, correcting himself, "I believe you prefer your maiden name now. My name is Daniel Peterson. I represent the estate of Robert Miller and his descendants." He explained that, armed with the undeniable proof she had uncovered, the Miller family had won a landmark settlement against the remnants of the Davenport Corporation. They had reclaimed not only a vast fortune, but, more importantly, their family's honor. "The Miller family," the lawyer continued, his voice filled with a sincere gravity, "believe that this victory would have been impossible without your courage. They see you not as a whistleblower, but as an agent of justice for a crime that went unpunished for 50 years. They have instructed me to tell you that their grandfather's legacy is now, in part, your legacy too." He then handed her a thick, formal envelope. Inside was not a thank you note, but a certified cashier's check. The number written on it was staggering, a figure so large it seemed unreal. It was a significant percentage of the settlement, a reward for the truth she had unearthed. Elara stared at the check, not with shock or elation, but with a deep, soul-shaking sense of completion. She had never sought riches. She had only sought justice. But in the end, her quest had brought her a different kind of wealth. Freedom, the absolute, unburdened freedom to build any life she chose, on her own terms, with her own hands, on a foundation of unshakable truth. She never saw any of the Davenports again. Their story ended in that ballroom, while hers was just beginning. She eventually started a small boutique architectural firm, one that specialized in creating beautiful, sustainable, and honest public spaces, libraries, schools, community shelters. She built things that were meant to last. Looking back, she understood that the rage and the pain had been the fire she needed to forge herself into someone new. She learned the most profound lesson of her life. You should never, ever underestimate the quiet dignity of a person who has endured too much for too long. For when they finally decide to stand up, their silence transforms into a voice that can shatter mountains, and their resolve becomes a force that can bring hollow empires to their knees. Justice, Alara now knew, is not always about what happens in a courtroom. Sometimes, it's about a truth, long buried, finally seeing the light of day. And sometimes, it's about a woman in a crimson dress, walking away from the ruins, ready to build again. Thank you for joining us on this story. Please come back for the next story, where another family's secrets are waiting to be discovered.